Imagine yourself at 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany, on August 17, 1943, where the oxygen mask freezes against Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke's face. He stares through the canopy of his Messerschmitt at a sight defying all comprehension, as he and his fellow pilots, barely 40 fighters scrambled from bases across southern Germany, find themselves confronting an aerial armada of staggering, impossible proportions. Through the crystalline air, you would see 376 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, split between targets at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, resembling a massive silver glacier flowing across the sky. Their polished aluminum surfaces reflect the morning sun in blinding sheets of light. Yet each bomber bristles with 13.50 caliber machine guns, flying in combat boxes that create interlocking fields of fire capable of throwing up a wall of lead at any approaching fighter. Knoke's unit, Jagdgeschwader 11, along with elements from Jagdgeschwader 1 and 26, faced mathematics that seemed to mock human courage. 40 German fighters standing against hundreds of American heavy bombers. You must realize that these odds, which would have been dismissed as Allied propaganda just months earlier, had become the daily reality for Luftwaffe pilots, who were witnessing the physical manifestation of an American industrial supremacy destined to eventually drown the Third Reich. You can trace the transformation from German aerial dominance to complete annihilation, which occurred with shocking speed between 1943 and 1944. While the Wehrmacht had swept across Europe in 1940, with the Luftwaffe ruling supreme, by August 1943, pilots were experiencing a reversal so complete that many described it as watching their world turn upside down. As American bombing operations reached a scale the German military planners had never conceived possible. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, officially designated Mission 84, represented a new evolution in strategic bombing that you should understand as a pivotal moment. Colonel Curtis LeMay's 4th Bombardment Wing led 146 B-17s against the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, while 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing struck the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Targets chosen because ball bearings were a critical bottleneck, and Regensburg produced nearly a third of all German single-engine fighters. The strategic intent was clear: to destroy Germany's ability to produce fighters, while crippling overall war production through ball-bearing shortages. In response, Adolf Galland scrambled every available aircraft: Jagdgeschwader 1 Osor from Dielen and Schiphol, Jagdgeschwader 11 from Jever and Oldenburg, and Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter from Lille and Wevelgem, forcing elite units who had dominated the skies over France and Russia to face odds that rendered their skill and courage almost meaningless. To pierce these formations, the Germans developed desperate tactics. Heinz Knoke himself pioneered the technique of dropping bombs from fighters onto the formations from above. On March 22, 1943, he became the first pilot in aviation history to destroy a B-17 using this method. And in his memoir, I Flew for the Führer, he describes the experimental nature of these attacks and his relentless determination to find new ways to break up the American defensive boxes. However, you will find that such innovations were mere pinpricks against the growing American presence. And by Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, the situation was even more daunting. During this second Schweinfurt raid, as 291 B-17s crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe scrambled over 300 fighters. Major Heinz Baer's 2nd JG-1 launched Focke-Wulf 190s, armed with WWII-21 rockets, their red bands contrasting with the yellow Reich defense markings of Jagdgeschwader 11. The German pilots achieved what seemed like a victory, shooting down 60 bombers for a 20.6% loss rate that forced the Americans to temporarily suspend deep penetration raids. Yet the cost was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe, with nearly 40 fighters lost, including irreplaceable veterans like Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, Adolf Galland's younger brother, whose death represented hundreds of hours of combat experience that Germany could never replace. You must consider that each B-17G flying fortress carried formidable defensive armament, and when 18 to 21 aircraft flew in a mutual support combat box, they brought devastating firepower against attackers. This innovation made frontal attacks suicidal and beam attacks dangerous, meaning that despite the individual superiority of the Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 or the Focke-Wulf 190A4, reaching the bombers had become an increasingly difficult feat. By late 1943, the introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks extended escort ranges, and by March 1944, when P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin, German fighters were fighting for survival before even reaching the bombers. This desperation spawned the Sturmgruppe concept. Specially armored Focke-Wulf 190s, designed to close to point-blank range to fire 30mm cannons, with pilots expected to ram the bombers if their ammunition was expended. These Sturmbock attacks required extraordinary courage, as pilots essentially flew reinforced fighters through the formations, sometimes literally chopping through wings or tails with their propellers. Ultimately, the fate of these elite fighter units offers you a microcosm of the entire conflict, illustrating the tragic descent from technical superiority into a desperate, sacrificial defense. Jagdgeschwader 1. Ösau stands as a grim exemplar of this decline, named in honor of Walter Ösau, one of Germany's premier aces with 127 victories, who was killed in action on May 11, 1944. His death at the hands of P-38 Lightnings symbolized a dark, new reality. Even the most skilled aviators could no longer survive the overwhelming odds. The unit burned through its commanding officers at an unsustainable pace. Between the loss of Major Hans Philipp in October 1943 and Ösau's death just 7 months later, leadership became a revolving door of fatalities. Although the wing would claim over 700 enemy aircraft during the war, the cost was exorbitant, with casualties including 464 killed in action and nearly 100 in accidents, surpassing its total nominal strength. On the Channel front, Jagdgeschwader 26, Schlageter, commanded by Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, managed to hold the line through the invasion of Normandy, but at a terrible price. Despite maintaining impressive kill ratios in specific engagements, the unit faced catastrophic rates of attrition that decimated its ranks. Of the 754 pilots who flew with the wing during the conflict, 584 were either killed or wounded, resulting in a staggering 77% casualty rate. By the end of 1943, the situation was already desperate. Out of 185 assigned pilots, only 107 remained available for combat operations. In April 1943, Jagdgeschwader 11 was established specifically to counter the growing bomber threat, pioneering tactics such as the use of BR-21 rockets. These modified 21-centimeter mortar tubes allowed fighters to fire time-fused projectiles into tight bomber formations from a safe distance of 1,000 meters. While these innovations allowed the unit to claim significant numbers of heavy bombers during intense clashes, such tactical successes could not reverse the strategic tide. The fundamental disparity was simple. The Americans could easily replace their fallen airmen and lost machines, while Germany had lost the capacity to do either. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's training program proved far more devastating than any single battlefield defeat. Before the war, German pilot training had been exemplary, demanding over 250 flight hours that included rigorous instruction in aerobatics, formation flying, and gunnery. By 1944, this curriculum had been slashed to a mere 112 hours, which were often left incomplete due to critical fuel shortages. In stark contrast, United States Army Air Force pilots arrived at the front with over 300 hours of flight time, fully prepared for combat, while their German counterparts were thrust into battle barely able to handle their aircraft. Johannes Steinhoff, a celebrated ace with 176 aerial victories, vividly described this tragedy in his memoirs, recalling how he received reinforcements who were essentially children. These young recruits often had only 100 hours of total flight time, and perhaps as few as 10 hours on the complex Bf-109. Yet commanders were expected to make them battle-ready in just 2 weeks. The statistics confirm the lethality of this cycle. During the first half of 1943 alone, the fighter force lost 1,100 pilots, wiping out 60% of its strength from January. Most new arrivals survived between 8 and 30 days, leaving only the unit commanders with any meaningful combat experience. The final, fatal blow was delivered by the Allied oil campaign, which systematically targeted the synthetic fuel plants that provided 92% of Germany's aviation gasoline. Following a massive strike by 935 bombers on May 12, 1944, production plummeted from 175,000 tons in April to just 5,000 tons by September. Albert Speer reported in July that 98% of all Axis fuel plants were out of operation, creating a paralyzing bottleneck. This resource starvation rendered the Luftwaffe impotent, regardless of how many aircraft rolled off the assembly lines. By the end of that week, you find the Luftwaffe had suffered the loss of 262 fighters and approximately 100 experienced pilots, including the Knight's Cross holder, Hauptmann Kurt Uben, who had 110 victories to his name. In contrast, while the Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, these were material losses they could replace within a matter of days, definitively demonstrating that American fighters now owned German airspace. The psychological collapse arrived on March 6, 1944, when 730 B-17s and B-24s bombed Berlin in broad daylight, escorted by 800 fighters, including P-51 Mustangs. For German pilots, seeing American fighters operating with impunity over the Reich capital shattered their final illusions, as the Luftwaffe could only mount 83 sorties against this massive armada, resulting in heavy losses for minimal impact. Adolf Galland later reflected on this moment, writing, "March 6, 1944, was when I knew absolutely the war was lost. Not because Berlin was bombed. It had been bombed before, but because it was bombed in daylight, with the Americans losing barely 5%, while we lost 30%. The memoirs of the Luftwaffe's elite provide you with intimate testimony to this harrowing journey from supremacy to total annihilation, as they found themselves overwhelmed by sheer material superiority." In his book, The First and the Last, Galland argued that a fighter pilot's true element is to attack, track, hunt, and destroy, noting, "Only in this way can the eager and skillful fighter pilot display his ability, tie him to a narrow and confined task, rob him of his initiative, and you take away from him the best and most valuable qualities he possesses: aggressive spirit, joy of action, and the passion of the hunter." Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran of 993 combat missions, observed that by this stage, the Reich's leadership had abandoned every standard of responsible action toward both their own people and the enemy, leaving the fighter pilots trapped in the middle of this madness. You can trace a striking evolution in Heinz Knoke's perspective. Early in the war, he had written that the prospect of combat appealed to him, but by 1944, his tone had shifted to recording the absolute pointlessness of resistance against overwhelming odds. Major Heinz Beer, who finished the war with 221 victories, described this progression starkly. In 1940, we owned the sky. In 1941, we shared it with the RAF. By 1943, we were disputing it with the Americans. By 1944, we were merely trying to survive in it. The Messerschmitt Me 262 represented a tragedy of German technical superiority rendered meaningless by strategic incompetence. As the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied rival, it should have changed everything. Although Germany produced approximately 1,430 Me 262s, Hitler's insistence on deploying them as bombers delayed their use as fighters until late 1944. When Galland demonstrated the jet, remarking that it felt as though angels were pushing, Hitler asked only about its bomb capacity. Even when finally permitted for fighter operations, you see that fuel shortages and training deficits severely limited their impact, with Jagdgeschwader 7 rarely able to put more than 30 jets airborne simultaneously. Against 1,000-plane raids, even this revolutionary technology proved insufficient. The complete collapse of the Luftwaffe was laid bare on June 6, 1944. Despite years of preparing for an invasion, Luftflotte 3 had only 100 operational fighters available to oppose 11,590 Allied sorties. The Luftwaffe managed a total of 319 sorties, with just 35 flown by fighters, leading to Joseph Priller's legendary and futile response. With the entire Jagdgeschwader 26 relocated days prior, leaving only Priller and his wingman Heinz Knoke at Lille, they were ordered to attack the invasion beaches alone. Priller later recalled, "Attack the invasion with 2 fighters? It was insane." Yet they made one strafing pass over Sword Beach before fleeing, effectively constituting the Luftwaffe's entire daylight response to history's greatest amphibious invasion. Casualties among fighter pilots reached catastrophic levels, with the Luftwaffe suffering 26,800 pilots killed or missing during the war, and by 1944, monthly loss rates became unsustainable. If you look at the statistics for 1944, the attrition rate rose relentlessly. 16.9% in January, 18.2% in February, 21.7% in March, 19.8% in April, 24.3% in May, and 25.8% in June. These percentages essentially meant a complete turnover of a unit's personnel every 4 months, with entire flying schools graduating classes directly into death. The December 1943 class from Jagdfliegerschule 5 suffered 80% casualties within 3 months, and individual units hemorrhaged pilots at an alarming rate between January and June of 1944. Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 58 pilots. Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen lost 67, and Jagdgeschwader 11 suffered 73 deaths. When Priller took command of Jagdgeschwader 26 in January 1943, he had 23 pilots with over 100 missions, but by June 1944, only 3 remained. Compounding these failures, German intelligence catastrophically underestimated American industrial capacity, estimating 1942 production at 18,000 against an actual 47,836, and 1943 production had 30,000 against an actual 85,898. By 1944, their estimate of 50,000 aircraft faced a reality of 96,318. When Göring received reports of American fighter production reaching 3,000 monthly, he dismissed them as propaganda and ordered them burned. yet actual production exceeded 3,600. You can see the scale of this industrial might in the B-17 alone, which saw 12,731 units produced, with Boeing's Seattle plant completing 16 daily at its peak, while Ford's Willow Run churned out one B-24 every 63 minutes. Even with Speer's reforms driving German industrial output to its absolute zenith of 39,807 aircraft in 1944, the nation fundamentally lacked both the fuel and the pilots to operate them. In stark contrast, America single-handedly manufactured 96,318 units that same year, and when British and Soviet contributions were added, it created a crushing 4-to-1 numeric disadvantage that Germany had no hope of overcoming. By March of 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper, a hollow shell of its former self. Of the more than 1,000 fighters theoretically listed on the roster, perhaps only 100 were actually airworthy on any given day. Fuel shortages were so severe that they permitted only a single sortie per pilot each week, while the majority of new aviators were sent into battle with fewer than 50 hours of flight experience. On March 18, 1945, Heinz Knoke flew his final mission, capturing the grim reality in his diary. Battered machines, exhausted men, empty fuel tanks, and the absolute certainty of defeat. The mathematical trajectory that had been evident since 1943 had finally reached its inevitable and terminal conclusion. The material and human cost was staggering, with the Luftwaffe losing approximately 76,875 aircraft during the war, including 43,000 in direct combat. The human toll included 165,000 aircrew killed, 155,000 wounded, and 192,000 missing or captured. Conversely, the American 8th Air Force suffered 26,000 fatalities out of over 350,000 personnel, a grievous figure, yet one that remained strategically sustainable. The production differential was simply insurmountable. In 1944 alone, the Allied powers churned out 163,099 aircraft, compared to Germany's 39,807. No degree of individual valor could bridge such a chasm, and the destruction of the Luftwaffe offers enduring lessons about the nature of industrial warfare. German aviators, originally the most skilled and experienced in the world, were obliterated not by lack of bravery, but by the cold logic of mathematical inevitability. The American strategy of mass production and adequate training for a vast number of pilots proved superior to the German reliance on individual excellence, meaning that even as German aces tallied spectacular kill counts, they remained powerless to alter an outcome preordained by production statistics. When German defenders confronted these massive formations, with only a handful of fighters, they were witnessing the brutal truth of industrial warfare. Individual excellence, however admirable, cannot overcome systemic superiority. When industrial might reaches a sufficient differential, the outcomes become mathematically certain, presenting a scenario where the sheer volume of material dictates the victor. The German fighter pilots who faced American bomber formations from 1943 to 1944 witnessed something unprecedented: complete airspace dominance achieved through industrial might. Veterans described skies so thick with silver bombers that they stretched to the horizon, a metallic tide that announced not just military defeat, but the definitive end of an era. The transition from hunter to hunted happened with shocking rapidity. The same force that had swept the European skies clean in 1940 could barely protect its own airfields by 1944. This was not a slow decline, but a catastrophic collapse, culminating in the fighter pilots' revolt of January 1945, where those who had denied reality the longest finally acknowledged the end. When Germany's top aces confronted Goering with the truth that the war was lost and further combat meant meaningless death, they were voicing the silent knowledge of every aviator. German pilots learned modern warfare's harshest lesson, that individual brilliance is irrelevant against overwhelming material force. Yet they flew anyway, driven by duty, habit, or the simple fact that they knew no other life. In their defeat lay profound lessons about production and power, and the limits of courage when pitted against material superiority. The German pilots who faced those bomber armadas did not just lose a war, they witnessed warfare's transformation into an industrial equation with predetermined outcomes. Their testimony stands as a historical witness to the fact that they fought mathematical certainty and lost, not from a lack of skill or courage, but because they faced an enemy that had transformed war into industrial mathematics. The German fighter pilots of 1943 to 1945 learned in blood that when the sky fills with enough metal, individual warriors become irrelevant. The age of the ace had ended, and the age of mass production had begun.